Welcome to the Humanities Forum. My name is Ian Bernhoft. I'm the coordinator of the forum, which meets most Fridays throughout the semester to bring in speakers, professors, journalists, academics from around the country and around the world to share with you their research, to explore new ideas, and to help you deepen your appreciation for and understanding of the humanities. Today is a special event in that it's the keynote address of the St. Nicholas of Myra Conference on Catholic social thought. That's St. Nicholas right there. I found him myself. And in a minute, I'm going to give the microphone over to my colleague from philosophy, Dr. Alicia Carlson, to introduce our speaker. I just want to tell you what to expect, which is, first of all, we have our talk. At the end, there's always about 20 minutes of Q&A. We wrap up right at 4:45. And the first question, by longstanding tradition, has to be asked by a student. So get those wheels turning. Afterwards, you should definitely head down the hall to the great room where we have a reception, and you can have something tasty to eat and drink, and talk about what you heard, talk about what you're doing next. So, with that, I would say, I would encourage you, maybe even require you, to close those laptops down. You don't need them here. You can just use your eyes and ears and pens and papers. During Q&A, when the microphone comes to you, well, wait for the microphone to come to you so that everybody can hear your question. And just begin by introducing yourself. Say, this is my name, this is my major, this is my question. All right. With that, I'm going to turn the microphone over, as I promised, to Dr. Carlson.
Hello, everybody. Nice to see some of my students here. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. I know everybody always says that when they introduce them, but I really mean it. Not that I don't in the past, but our speaker today, Professor Tom Jeannot, who hails from Gonzaga University. Professor Jeannot has been teaching there since 1986, but he did a short stint at Seattle University while I was there, and so it was an honor and a total pleasure to have Tom as my colleague at Seattle U, and we have not seen each other since, 20 years. So Dr. Jeannot has a very broad range of philosophical interests. He's published many works on moral philosophy, personalism, philosophical hermeneutics, Hegelian Marxism and critical theory, American pragmatism, and the thought of Bernard Lonergan. He is the co-editor of a volume on Thinking with Whitehead and the American Pragmatists, Experience and Reality. And today he'll be sharing his thoughts on Dorothy Day in a paper entitled The Paradox of Dorothy Day, Humanism and Personalism. And I just want to say I can't think of somebody better poised to be the inaugural speaker for a conference on Catholic social thought, because one of the things I remember most fondly about being colleagues with Tom is his commitment, deep commitment to issues of social justice, equality, and so welcome him with me, and I want to thank him personally for all the things that I've learned from him, and I'm sure you will learn from him too. Thank you.
Couple of quick points before I start. First of all, I noticed I'm listed as emeritus in this program. I felt a little bit like Mark Twain, still teaching. Second thing is I'm going to be citing a lot of mid-20th century authors who are writing in American English and using a masculinist idiom and using man when they mean humanity or humankind. And I've left the text verbatim as they're written, but this grates on some people's ears, including my own. So I just wanted to let you know that. For the paper I've written, now, if you think this is going to be long, the original was 60 pages, so I'm not going to read 60 pages, but I'm going to read for a while. And I start out with some epigraphs. I have 3 one from Dorothy Day, one from a Scottish philosopher named John McMurray, and one from Thomas Merton. And I'll skip those except for a day in April of 1948 On Pilgrimage. And she writes, "Perhaps if we thought of how Karl Marx was called Papa Marx by all the children on the street, if we knew and remembered how he told fairy stories to his children, how he suffered hunger and poverty and pain, how he sat by the body of his dead child and had no money for coffin or funeral, perhaps such thoughts as these would make us love him and his followers." So let's get started. In 1962, at a symposium on behaviorism and phenomenology at Rice University, Carl Rogers, the personalist psychologist who affirmed the therapeutic efficacy of unconditional positive regard, crossed paths with B.F. Skinner, the radical behaviorist. Rogers claimed that he was attempting to go beyond behaviorism. Skinner rejoined that he was not convinced that the things Dr. Rogers sees and infers are primary moving forces. They seem to me to be epiphenomenal in a philosophical sense, or at least something which occurs after the fact. Well, as we would have expected, these two psychologists were just ships passing in the night. But Ludwig Wittgenstein's student Norman Malcolm also happened to be a symposiist, and he was committed neither to behaviorism nor to personalism. In his symposium paper with respect to the difference between private and public events, Malcolm defended the idea that self-testimony, the first personal report of one's own experience, has an autonomous status. He wrote, "The first-person psychological sentences must be correlated with behavior up to a point, but they quickly go beyond that point." He continued, "Within the whole body of language, the category of first-person psychological sentences has crucial importance. Man's puzzling status as subject and a person is bound up with these first-person utterances having two striking characteristics. First, that for the most part, they are not made on the basis of any observation. Second, that they are autonomous in the sense that, for the most part, they cannot be tested by checking them against physical events and circumstances other than the subject's own testimony. If we want to know what a man wants, what he is thinking about, whether he is annoyed or pleased, or what he has decided, the man himself is our best source of information. We ask him, and he tells us. He has a privileged status with respect to information about himself, and not because he has had an extended contact with his own behavior for many years. In the ensuing discussion, as he is pressed, Malcolm's criticism turns withering when he says, when a person reports a headache, he reports it and does not seek justification for that report by looking in the mirror or taking his temperature or asking someone if he looks as if he has a headache. The puzzlement, which is justified, is a philosophical one, arising from the assumption that the statement, "I have a headache," being an indicative sentence about a state, must be based on observation. When a member of the audience continues to press him, he responds, "There must be some misunderstanding here. Does this headache make any difference in your activities? Do you say, well, I had better not go to the concert?" It is true that it would be a piece of nonsense to report having a headache and not having some correlated change in behavior. But I do not verify that I have a headache by noticing that I have declined an invitation to go to the concert. That's funny. We can let Malcolm's criticisms of Skinner's radical behaviorism stand in for a fuller discussion of this question concerning the place of first personal statements in the architecture of knowledge and self-knowledge. This is the problem that Gilbert Ryle, the mid-20th century behaviorist, philosopher of ordinary language, called the systematic elusiveness of I. He writes that one can, in principle, never catch more than the coattails of the object of his pursuit. He is always a day late for the fair, but every day he reaches the place of yesterday's fair. He never succeeds in jumping onto the shadow of his own head, yet he is never more than one jump behind. This paper is about the pursuit of the systematically elusive I. Behaviorism solves the problem by way of reduction. Thus, Skinner held that private as well as public events must be physical, which in effect reduces the difference between private and public to the vanishing point. On the other hand, personalism solves the problem by way of sublation, a series along an ascending gradient of successively higher viewpoints, as Bernard Lonergan called them, in which higher order operations integrate lower order operations into new synthetic unities. Higher viewpoints are more capable of taking complexity and nuance on board. The complexity of and nuance of Joyce's Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake, for example. They are more differentiated rather than undifferentiated. They are also more inclusive and encompassing relative to the narrower viewpoints they supersede. Lonergan calls the type of abstraction involved in sublation enriching abstraction, as opposed, and I'll quote Lonergan now, to the simple and common view, on the other hand, which is implicated, which is that the abstract is an impoverished replica of the concrete. The simple and common view, on the other hand, is implicated in the way that Ryle sets up the problem in the first place, and we will return to this point below. One reason to profile behaviorism in the context of a personalist philosophy is that there is nearly a consensus within the specialized empirical science of psychology today that the history of behaviorism, from Pavlov to John B. Watson, and from Watson to Skinner, is a failed history. Yet, in 1971, Skinner graced the cover of Time magazine. His book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, was the talk of the town and stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for 20 weeks. In that book, Skinner criticized the myth of the inner man, just as he had a decade earlier in his symposium paper. He likened a mythical inner man to the homunculus. Following up in About Behaviorism, book from 1974, he asked his famous rhetorical question, what is inside the skin? Although Skinner himself had been working on problems of behavioral analysis since the 1930s, the meteoric rise of his theory in the 70s was followed by an equally precipitous decline under the impact of the cognitive revolution inside the science of psychology itself. The reason to contrast behaviorism with personalism is that with respect to their methods and aims, they are mutually exclusive. One committed to reducing and eliminating complexity, the other committed to accounting for and even adding complexity. In the disjunctive syllogism of this difference, if behaviorism is true, then personalism must be false. On the other hand, the breakdown of behaviorism as the going paradigm of scientific psychology should incentivize and catalyze the search for an alternative, one that is directly responsive to the problem of the systematic elusiveness of I. The rise and fall of a century of behaviorism is a play that can be staged in 3 acts. In 1897, Pavlov published his studies of salivating dogs and discovered the mechanism of classical conditioning, stimulus and response. If Pavlov's general tendency was reductive, side by side with it at virtually the same time, in 1896, the American philosopher John Dewey published his article, The Reflex Arc Concept in Psychology, which resisted a mechanical interpretation and proposed instead to start with the idea of the organism already dynamically involved with the world and aiming toward unified activity. As Thomas Alexander puts it, this was Dewey's attempt to have Hegel and Thomas Huxley at once. Thus, in this opening act, a pattern is established. A mechanistic explanation is met head-on by an organic, holistic explanation, exemplifying the non-reductive character of Dewey's kind of naturalism. The pattern repeats in a second act from the interwar decades. Dewey's collaborator was the non-reductive naturalist George Herbert Mead, who placed his own behaviorist program in Mind, Self, and Society from 1934, side by side his contemporaries, John B. Watson's methodological behaviorism, which once again took a mechanistic approach to human behavior. Inside the naturalism of the behaviorist program, then, there are internal tensions between reduction and sublation, and between a mechanistic approach and the organic approach of a deeply Aristotelian holism. The last act of this 20th century history is the further development from Watson's methodological behaviorism to Skinner's radical behaviorism, which brings us around full circle to Malcolm's critique of Skinner. In turn, this is a history that is closely intertwined with the history and fate of naturalistic humanism. Naturalistic humanism is secular by design. Critiques of secular humanism abound, but they are not paradoxical. The paradox is that just as there is a religious side to the naturalistic humanism of Dewey, so too there is a secular side to the religious humanism of Dorothy Day. Although secular humanism reduces or washes out just the aspect of reality to which personalism is most profoundly committed. So close and yet so far. Probably the leanest way to state the paradox would be to spread the rumor that Day is a Christian communist. A recent writer on Day even affiliates her with cultural Marxism. The rejoinder is simple. As the Brazilian Archbishop and liberation theologian Dom Helder Camara put it in a memorable aphorism, when I feed the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist. Before we lose sight of it, let's put Day on the record. In Our Brothers, the Communists, written in 1949, just as the Red Scare was on again and the Cold War was becoming the dominant motif of American life, Day wrote, "First of all, let it be remembered that I speak as an ex-communist, but I must speak from my own experiences. My radical associates were the ones who were in the forefront of the struggle for a better social order where there would not be so many poor. What if we do not agree with the means taken to achieve this goal, nor with their fundamental philosophy? We do believe in, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. We believe in the withering away of the state. We believe in the communal aspect of property, as stressed by the early Christians and since then by the religious orders. We believe in the constructive activity of the people, the masses, and the mutual aid which existed during medieval times, worked out from below. We believe in loving our brothers regardless of race, color, or creed, and we believe in showing this love by working immediately for better conditions and ultimately for the ownership by the workers of the means of production. We believe in an economy based on human needs rather than on the profit motive. In this passage, Day's creedal statements lie like a palimpsest over the elementary theses of Marxism. Still, there is an essential and radical difference between secular and religious humanism. Grappling with this difference is one philosophical way of negotiating the paradox of Dorothy Day. Marx and Dewey, each of whom is a metaphilosophical naturalist and a poster child for the outlook and ethos of secular humanism, belong to the deep philosophical background of Dorothy Day's way of encountering the world. We can, and in the long run, I believe we should take an ecumenical approach to this difference between naturalistic humanism and personalism, the personalism constituting the philosophical backbone of the Catholic worker movement. However, in this paper, my purpose will be to emphasize the distinction. To bring life to these philosophical abstractions, we can come closer to the dramatic pattern of Day's own experience by considering her close friendships with lifelong American communists like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and Mike Gold, going all the way back to the days when she first cut her teeth as a journalist, covering the tenement slums of New York for radical publications like The Call, The Masses, and The Liberator, where anarchists, socialists, and communists fought out the issues of the day with the full-throated zeal of the lyrical left. In her memorial for the wobbly Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, which she entitles Red Roses for her, she calls Flynn my sister in the deep sense of the word. Flynn is the rebel girl immortalized by Joe Hill's song, whom Day had known since she was 18 years old, and who, when she died in 1964, was the secretary of the Communist Party of the United States. In the context of the Second Vatican Council, in which the church was declared to be the people of God, Day wrote of Flynn, "She always did what the laity is nowadays urged to do. She felt a responsibility to do all in her power in defense of the poor, to protect them against injustice and destitution." For Mike Gold, she wrote, Neither revolutions nor faith is won without keen suffering. We cannot help but ask how this servant of God, on her way to canonization, could also be a communist in the sense of agreeing with Marx verbatim. Or conversely, why isn't Flynn herself, the communist, rebel girl, and Day's deep sister, why isn't she also not a candidate for Catholic sainthood? Is it possible to move in the humanist orbit of Marx and Dewey and simultaneously to move in the personalist orbit of the last three Catholic papacies, of St. Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis? If we were to answer only paradoxically, then we can define a paradox as an apparent contradiction, and then the contradiction might be subject to a resolution, as we will try to foresee. But before we turn more concretely to the paradox of Dorothy Day, let's play out the rest of the philosophical hand. The argument is that naturalistic humanism fails, but personalism succeeds in pinning down the systematic elusiveness of the first and second persons of speech and action. Specifically, the difference between secular and religious humanism is the difference between the naturalistic humanism we have just begun to discuss, on the one hand, and what Jacques Maritain called integral humanism, or personalism, on the other hand, and especially the personalism of Emmanuel Mounier, Peter Morin, and Dorothy Day. This difference matters most in the dimension of personal reality itself. Naturalistic humanism fails at just the point that makes the move to personalism exigent. Naturalistic humanism joins Marx to Dewey by way of their family resemblance. It is non-reductive rather than reductive, organic rather than mechanistic, and holistic rather than atomistic. The term emergentism is used to characterize views that would be the opposite of reductionist views like radical behaviorism. Inside behaviorism itself in the mid-20th century, the tension between these views was exemplified by Mead's criticisms of Watson's mechanistic approach. As Dewey's closest collaborator from their Michigan and Chicago days, Mead and Dewey were even closer to holding identical views than Marx and Engels. But we recited our miniature history of behaviorism from Pavlov to Watson and Mead, and from Watson and Mead to Skinner. From a personalist standpoint, what always comes late to the fair, in just the way that Ryle poeticized, is naturalistic humanism itself. In other words, this version of humanism is worked out conceptually within the larger conceptual architecture of metaphilosophical naturalism, by which I mean the a priori or axiomatic denial that there is such a theorem as the theorem of the supernatural, of the grace that completes and perfects nature. And my source, again, is Father Lonergan. In other words, the sort of naturalism in question would be a closed system. Put another way, the pressure would be on to bring the system within the scope of the principle of causal closure. Let's call this the reductive pressure. So it is figuratively that Skinner's radical behaviorism rises to the apogee of behaviorist thought, while Mead's Deweyan behaviorism fades away into historical memory. Figuratively, within a closed naturalism, the reductive pressure is nearly unavoidable, Skinner over Mead. The fundamental philosophical problem concerns the way that the behaviorist Ryle and others treat abstraction, not as enriching abstraction, like Father Lonergan, but according to the simple and common view that the abstract is an impoverished replica of the concrete. Enriching abstraction can also be called concretion or concrescence. But the simple and common view entails what Patrick Murray and Gene Schuler in False Moves in Philosophy and Social Theory call a purist split between the abstract, the impoverished replica on the one hand, and the concrete on the other hand. In False Moves, Murray and Schuler criticize what they call factoring philosophy. They write, false moves arise from phenomenological mistakes. They involve treating as separable what can be distinguished analytically, but is inseparable. For example, we can distinguish the color of the apple from its shape. But color cannot exist without shape. Factoring philosophy mistakes what is distinguishable but not separable for the separable. Employing a phrase coined by James Collins, Murray and Schuler write, we call these purist splits. For Murray and Schuler, the rectification or conceptual healing of purist splits entails just enough phenomenology, which is the title of their last chapter. Or, they write, for those put off by the term phenomenology, what Murray and Schuler mean is experience-based inquiry. By contrast, false moves are inevitable when conceptual analysis is untethered from this necessary experience-based complement. Factoring philosophy is philosophy untethered from experience. But Murray and Schuler are scrupulously dedicated to following Berkeley's advice. They write, Berkeley's advice for thinking clearly is to hew closely to experience. In Murray and Schuler's capacious use of the term, we can go on to claim that personalism is phenomenological. We are back to the context of the symposium at Rice. Personalism also disavows purist splits. It distinguishes but does not separate the abstract from the concrete, the private from the public, the part from the whole, or most decisively, the subjective from the objective. Murray and Schuler write, most damagingly, factoring philosophy takes the subjective and objective to be separable, positing the purely subjective and the purely objective. Taken to be separable, the self and the world each reduces to an unknowable thing in itself or is discarded. In other words, Kant or nothing. For example, in their chapter on the question, is life absurd, they criticized Thomas Nagel's view that objectively considered life is absurd. If this view were correct, then meanings would be arbitrary, goods would be random, and purposes would be pointless. But Murray and Schuler write, without experiencing what is necessary, we could not recognize what is arbitrary. And I think this is a logical point. Without experiencing what is necessary, we could not recognize what is arbitrary. To exclude necessity from experience would eliminate the arbitrary as well. So Murray and Schuller go on to write that in general, troubles arise when observations and concepts mutate into the exclusive disjunction of the purely objective and the purely subjective. Pure subjectivity, not subjectivity, is a myth. Hegel, Marx, Heidegger, and Davidson, Murray and Schuller's primary sources, reach this conclusion in various ways. What is called subjective or mental, sensations, thoughts, concepts, feelings, language, belong to persons existing in the world. Every thought and feeling reveals the world, so they continue. Getting past the purest split between subjectivity and objectivity makes intellectual and existential integrity possible. Riffing on Nagel's title, they write, "Pure objectivity, the mutually exclusive counterpoint to pure subjectivity, would be impossibly a view from nowhere." On the other hand, Murray and Schuller write that for Nagel, what is missing from physicalist accounts of mind is what he calls the view from within. The resources of science to understand consciousness are incomplete in principle. Individual awareness acts as a firewall against the encroachments of objectivity. But this self that defies objective accounting verges on a vanishing point. The universe lacks a self. The self excludes the universe. Hence, Murray and Schuller conclude, one upshot of pitting subjectivity against objectivity is the emptying out of the self, or what Lonergan in Method and Theology calls the principle of the empty head. Advancing their position against Nagel's counterposition, Murray and Schuller write, pure subjectivity, like pure objectivity, is a myth, a stumbling block that philosophy must remove. Without subjective activity, there would be no knowledge. The point of this discussion of phenomenology, and so also of subjectivity, is to suggest that without a well-conceived notion of subjectivity that does not interpret subjectivity and objectivity to be mutually exclusive, a nearly permanent agnosticism concerning the ontological notion of personhood is virtually guaranteed. In our time and place, let's call this bourgeois agnosticism. But Murray and Schuller pivot on a new maxim. They write, in the discourse of truth and error, which they aim to recover, the maxim, the more subjective, the more objective, replaces that of the discourse of the subjective and objective, whose maxim is, the less subjective, the better. The terminus ad quem of the latter maxim is what Donald Davidson calls the featureless self. The featureless self is counterpositional to the notion of the person. By contrast, Ryle's behaviorist problem of the systematically elusive I is manifest in Skinner's reduction to physicalism. Behind Ryle and Skinner, we discover a defective phenomenology. Quoting Murray and Schuller again, the mistaken phenomenological judgment that mind and world are separable. Personalism does not make this mistaken phenomenological judgment. It does not discard subjectivity from a putative would-be objectivity. In the larger survey of the grand history of European philosophy, the historical origin of factoring philosophy is the conceptual universe of the 17th and 18th centuries, from the dualism of Cartesian philosophy to the residual Cartesianism of Locke's treatment of personal identity in his 1690 thought experiment concerning the prince and the cobbler, which treats memory as a surrogate for self-consciousness and felt self-presence, and which finally runs aground, falling into bourgeois agnosticism, on Kant's further attempt to reconcile Descartes and Hume, Leibniz and Locke, by way of positing the unknowable thing in itself. For an exposition of the basic philosophical problem from the personalist point of view, I will depart from the Catholic intellectual tradition for economy's sake and turn to the Scottish Quaker philosopher John McMurray, who developed his own distinctive personalism as a way of responding to the slaughter bench of World War I. He delivered the Gifford Lectures in 1953 and 54 with the title, The Form of the Personal. They were published in 2 volumes, The Self as Agent and Persons in Relation. His basic terms are action, in the Aristotelian sense of praxis, or in other words, a properly human act, and relationship, in a sense just the opposite of the common view of abstraction as an impoverished replica of what is taken to be concrete or actual or real. In The Self as Agent, McMurray establishes his starting point principally by way of a critique of Kant. He begins with the crisis of the personal. Next, he turns to Kant and the Romantics. Then he brings his argument home in chapter 3, the rejection of dualism. His argument, which we don't have time to develop here, is that Kant's fundamental mistake is his dualism of theory and practice, which is another purist split. It is this very dualism that necessitates his posit of an unknowable thing in itself. McMurray reformulates this dualism as a contradiction. In the second antinomy of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant denied that we can know that we are free rather than determined. But in the Critique of Practical Reason, he gave back with his right hand what he had taken away with his left by demonstrating that freedom must be granted as a postulate of pure practical reason in order for properly human action to occur, which is to say moral action. McMurray argues that this error has a fundamentally Cartesian basis. So he writes of the common root. Any philosophy that takes the cogito as its starting point and center of reference institutes a formal dualism of theory and practice. And this dualism makes it formally impossible to give any account and indeed to conceive the possibility of persons in relation. If we make the I think the primary postulate of philosophy, then not merely do we institute a dualism between theoretical and practical experience, but we make action logically inconceivable, a mystery, as Kant so rightly concludes, in which we necessarily believe, but which we can never comprehend. So McMurray responds with his call for a personalist revolution in 2 steps. I promise you this won't be so boring by the time we're done. The first is the step to a new starting point in the transposition of thought from the I think to the I say. This move to a higher viewpoint, quoting McMurray now, introduces the you as the correlative of the I. For if the I think logically excludes the second person, the I say makes the second person a logical necessity. Thus, the problem of the form of the personal emerges as the problem of the form of communication. One purist split cascades on another, so McMurray continues. If we could so isolate our theoretical activities from practical influences, from the emotional motives, for example, and the intentional valuations which determine our behavior, we should have destroyed our own integrity. We should need to become two selves, neither of which would be a complete self. There would be a practical or bodily self, which acts without thinking, and a theoretical, spiritual, or mental self, which thinks without acting. This is the genesis of the mind-body problem, which is in fact no problem but a patent absurdity. And because you've probably studied this in your courses, I want to tell you that I'm just quoting McMurray here. How could we determine the relation between two entities which are themselves constituted by a postulate of unrelatedness? This disrupted self is happily described by Professor Ryle as the ghost in the machine. We might comment with advantage that the machine is, of course, as imaginary as the ghost. McMurray's personalist solution is to achieve an integral conception of the unity of the personal self without purist splits. Once again, in the spirit of a deeply Aristotelian holism of outlook, which also profoundly influences the naturalistic humanism of Marx and Dewey. Nevertheless, McMurray's larger conception, based on beginning with practice and motivating his call for the personalist revolution, is that moving from an essentially mechanistic way of thinking to an organic way of thinking, since it is subject to the reductive pressure, falls short of the personal and is threatened with collapse. Earlier, we found Thomas Alexander writing that Dewey's article on the reflex arc was Dewey's attempt to have Hegel and Huxley at once. Dewey was the author in 1910 of The Influence of Darwin on Philosophy and other essays. But also in 1897, he gave his lecture on Hegel, which lead John Shook and James Good to claim that Dewey's mature philosophy can be seen to be a type of left Hegelianism. And in his autobiographical essay, From Absolutism to Experimentalism, Dewey wrote that Hegel's philosophy left a permanent deposit in his thinking, moving quickly now in his own attempt at conceptual healing. Hegel's greatest interlocutors were Kant and Aristotle. A shorthand expression can be found in Hegel's transposition in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, From Substance to Subject. So there is a constellation of figures, naturalistic humanists as well as personalists, secular humanists as well as philosophers and theologians working in the Catholic intellectual tradition, who are deeply Aristotelian in that they have Aristotelian commitments to holism, integration, unity, and the immanence of spirit in the world. Charles W. Morris calls Mead a post-Darwinian Aristotle. Thomas Alexander calls the immensely important chapters 7 and 8 of Experience in Nature Dewey's De Anima. Murray and Schuller, in turn themselves Hegelians and Aristotelians in this capacious sense, give us a powerful way of repudiating and moving beyond the purest split between dualism and reductionism. Still, following McMurray, the naturalistic humanism of Marx and Dewey falls short of achieving a satisfactory account of the reality of the person and personal reality itself by virtue of its metaphilosophical naturalism and the reductive pressure that goes along with this kind of philosophy. From a personalist perspective, Dewey's considerable effort to unify Hegel and Huxley gets an A for effort, but otherwise not a passing grade. Mutatis mutandis for Mead, in what a personalist would consider his failed attempt to derive the I-self from the me-self by way of his best-known distinction. We might say again that under the reductive pressure, the behaviorist Skinner trumps the behaviorist Mead. And we could plausibly say the same thing about the Hegelian Marxist Karl Marx, who can also plausibly be called an Aristotelian, but upon whom the reductive pressure is immense. For instance, Dewey and Mead were no closer collaborators than Marx and Engels across 4 decades. But then again, if Dewey attempted to reconcile Hegel with Huxley, George Lichtheim characterizes the degenerate philosophical move from Marx to Engels, Pace Engels, in a move he likens from Hegel to Ernst Haeckel. Whereas for the personalist McMurray, the unity of the self is neither a material nor an organic, but a personal unity. Therefore, against still another purist split, McMurray writes first that the isolated, purely individual self is a fiction, and second, that we should abandon the traditional individualism or egocentricity of our philosophy. We must introduce the second person as the necessary correlative of the first, and do our thinking not from the standpoint of the I alone, but of the you and I. Following McMurray's injunctions, the alternative and radical personalist recuperations of the reality of the first and second persons proceeds from the premise of the I-thou relation, which we can take like the spoils of Egypt from a rich variety of sources, beginning in our context with Hegel himself, who wrote in his Phenomenology, what lies ahead for consciousness is the experience of what spirit is, this consummate substance that amidst the perfect freedom and autonomy of its antithesis, namely diverse self-conscious beings existing for themselves, is their unity, an I that is a we, and a we that is an I. In his brief introduction to American idealism and personalism, Thomas O. Buford leads with the statement that American personalism is planted in the soil of German idealism. In the distinctive version of American personalism that settled in at Boston University around the same time William James and Josiah Royce continued their skirmish at Harvard, while meanwhile C.S. Peirce had exiled himself to Arisbe and James was promoting Dewey as the future of pragmatism, Borden Parker Bohn published Personalism in 1908. Edgar Sheffield Brightman and Peter A. Bertocci continued to develop this classical American form. Brightman was one of Martin Luther King's professors while King was working out his own personalism in his doctoral studies in systematic theology. Buford concludes his introduction by writing that Bohn's vision in metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and philosophy of religion articulated during the classical period of American thought, helped set an agenda for many thinkers throughout the 20th century, including Brightman and Bertocci, two leading personalist philosophers at Boston University, and Dr. King, the immensely influential civil rights leader. James and Bone were friends when James rediscovered the I-thou relation in his own way in The Will to Believe. Likewise, it was Josiah Royce who first named the beloved community in The Problem of Christianity. More recently in the US, the Bantu word Ubuntu, I am because we are, has been nearly anglicized, prospectively bringing a European and an American personalist tradition up to the level of alignment and solidarity with African philosophy. To put a cognate form of the underlying idea in a specifically Catholic way, the idea is cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart, an alternative way of thinking about subjectivity, about inwardness or interiority, and about integrity or authenticity, altogether outside of the Cartesian orientation against which our caste of Aristotelians, Hegelian Marxists, pragmatists, personalists, and Thomists, among the anarchists, socialists, and communists, with whom they were also allied, stand united as well, along with the spate of other personalist authors, in rejecting the binary trap that there are only two ways, two alternative ways to conceive our humanity, either some type of dualism or else reductionism, where dualism is mainly rejected and a reductive approach sometimes seems like the only philosophical game in town. By a contrast as basic as fundamental theology itself, cor ad cor loquitur condenses to the size of a single expression, Lonergan's theory of incarnate meaning. However, if it is true in retrospect that behaviorism fails in part because it is reductionist, then even the non-reductive forms of naturalism, Marx's or Dewey's and Mead's, for whom no form of dualism could have been an option, no ghost in the machine, in Ryle's anti-Cartesian phrase, then emergentist explanations, typically through the instrumentality of language, if they do not aptly and adequately account for the first and second persons of speech and action and the lived realities they denote, the personal realities of I, thou, and we, might also prove to be conceptually unstable or even forced to reverse course to the extent that naturalism is necessarily closed and subject to the physicalism of the theory of causal closure that axiomatically rules out the very possibility of a theorem of the supernatural. And if Skinnerian behaviorism fails, but metaphilosophical naturalism goes on to become the dominant philosophical attitude of contemporary English-speaking philosophy, then we should be on the lookout for other reductions, such as harnessing our philosophical anthropology to the specialized empirical sciences of neurology or evolutionary psychology, which neither ask nor answer the question John Kavanagh asks in Who Count as Persons. So I dedicated this paper to John Kavanagh. Kavanagh, who died in 2012, was a Midwestern Jesuit priest and philosopher at St. Louis University, where he worked out his own distinctive personalist philosophy. Since I must conclude, I will let Father Kavanagh stand in for a conclusion to the paradox of Dorothy Day. Kavanaugh was a phenomenological Thomist who deeply appreciated Hegel and Marx, as well as Herbert Marcuse, the doyen of the New Left. His appreciation for the New Left was very specifically an affair with the Catholic left, Dorothy Day, and the Catholic worker. His priestly friendship with Karen House in St. Louis was like his friend Daniel Berrigan's friendship with Catholic workers in New York. In short, Kavanaugh epitomized the way of life of a personalist Catholic worker and sealed it with his permanent stamp in Following Christ in a Consumer Society, originally 1981, which was published in a 25th anniversary edition in 2006, in part by developing an original distinction between the commodity form and the personal form based on his appropriation of Marx's theory of commodity fetishism. This classic of American personalism is structured by a two-part division, something like the Red Sea, between these opposite and mutually exclusive forms or ways of life. Kavanaugh's conclusion is entitled Revolutionary Holiness. The revolutionary character of holiness shows up in Kavanaugh's own life as the rejection, something like Marcuse's great refusal, of the commodity form of life and his adoption of its opposite, a Catholic worker form of life. The book that concludes to Revolutionary Holiness begins with an epigraph quoting a letter that Day wrote to her comrade, Stanley Vishnewski. Day wrote, "When it comes to the Catholic Church, I go to the right as far as I can go. But when it comes to labor, pacifism, and civil rights, then I go as far as I can to the left." And this is the paradox of Dorothy Day. I can't tell you how nervous you people made me up here.
So we've got time for probably 2 questions. Who'd like to get this started?
My strategy as a classroom teacher is to talk so much that I put my students in a coma. And then I ask them whether they have any questions. Please.
Do you think that Day's thought alone is anything without Chesterton and Belloc also without it?
What a great question. So, as I said, I'd written a very long paper, and the paper I've just read is also very long. But I was, Day's been nominated as Servant of God, and she's on her way to canonization, and a lot of people are nervous about this. And so there are a variety of strategies that a person could adopt in order to vindicate Day inside Catholicism. And, her son-in-law was this unfortunate alcoholic named David Hennessy. And I don't mean to slur Hennessy. But he despised all these anarchists and socialists and communists that were hanging around Mourne and Day and the Catholic worker. And he said what is true, that Day's thought could also be called distributism. And of course, then the sources would be Chesterton and Belloc. And so in a longer version of this paper, I would have wondered more about the adequacy of this solution. And I would have ended up contrasting the English at the turn of the century with the French. And in particular in the 1930s, when Emmanuel Mounier was the editor of Esprit, and some of you know this history better than I do, but French Catholicism was attempting to like re-engage the world. And Mounier, as the editor of Esprit, wanted to take up the leading philosophical currents of his own time, and they were three. They were the phenomenological movement, and existentialism, and of course Marxism. And Esprit was very sympathetic with a kind of Marxism that I called Hegelian Marxism in my paper, and that could be called maybe Western Marxism if we wanted a broad enough figure. Certainly not Marxism-Leninism, Bolshevism, Stalinism, Maoism, none of the above. So the church in its social teaching, as you probably already know, has always been in search of a third way between the extreme individualism of Western bourgeois societies on the one hand and collectivist societies like the Stalinized USSR after 1927. And I thought this might be a way of negotiating your very question, because after all, the itinerant, and I'd like to call him a hobo, Peter Morin, peasant of the pavements, was principally influenced by these French sources and by Mounier in particular. So I believe it was 35 or 36 when Emmanuel Mounier first published what he called a personalist manifesto, which is hard to find in English translation, but it is findable. So he wanted, and this is with Maritain's blessing, by the way, in case that's coming as news to anyone. He wanted to find a way to negotiate these currents of contemporary thought on the European continent with the thinking of the Catholic Church and its social thinking in particular. So Quadragesimo Anno had just come out in 1931, and Morin shows up in Dorothy Day's apartment, in late 1932, and by May Day, the rest is history when they're distributing the paper. So with all the world's respect I can muster for Chesterton and Belloc, I think it would be truer to the Catholic worker movement to turn to sources like Emmanuel Mounier and the sort of issues that he was trying to negotiate as a Catholic thinker. So,
got time for one more question over here.
Hi, I'm not to claim to know to be an expert in personalism or actually even know that much about it per se, but I'm just curious. In hearing your paper, there seems a lot of focus on the conscious aspects of life, consciousness, and I'm wondering about what about the unconscious aspects of life, and I'm not talking about behaviorism, like whatever, but like sexuality, the body, I mean, it comes off feeling a little like nice sounding and Kantian in this sort of sense of like what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to live, but it seems I'm not getting a lot of the more earthy sense of how life really happens and how humans, we grapple with desire, we grapple with with unconscious urges. Look at the country today. I mean, Trumpism. Is that, how do you explain that? I mean, I think that like getting into the unconscious, subconscious, those other aspects are important to understand where we are today. Otherwise, it comes off very kind of disconnected. And it sounds great, but up there in the clouds somewhere. But so maybe I'm missing something. Is there what does personalism have to say about that aspect?
Oh, you're gonna force my hand here. I'm a 20th century guy. I've gotten about as far as 1950 in my own thinking, so I still like paper and pens, and I like books. Here's Murray and Schuler's book, 2023. Let me promote it. But to get to your question, here's Robert Doran, at one time heading up the Center for Lonergan Studies and one of the editors of the collected works, writing a book called Theology and the Dialectics of History. And this is, and Kantian no. So a big point in my paper was to say that there is no Kantian solution to the problem I wanted to address.
Maybe more psychoanalytic, unconscious.
Yeah, so this is what Doran attempts to do. And the structure of this book, Theology and the Dialectics of History, astonishes me by bearing so many structural similarities to Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. So Doran begins with depth psychology. And regardless of what we might think about debates between Freud and Jung, Doran leans pretty heavily on Carl Jung and moves from that kind of predicate. So Lonergan and Insight has this definition of genuineness as a law of human development. And so in general, there's a tension between immanence and transcendence, which shows up in the human animal as a tension between the conscious and the unconscious components of personal development. And Lonergan simply writes that genuineness is the admission of this tension into consciousness. So I think your question's really an important question. And I personally am no psychologist, but I've always liked depth psychology. And that's where Doran turns, and that's where I would turn to develop a personalist answer to that question. And if my paper sounded unduly abstract, it's really meant to be quite concrete. It's meant to be a challenge to the commodity form of life, which we were just discussing over in the other building just a little while ago, which seduces us, I think perhaps all of us in this room. And so there is a kind of militancy to carrying the personalist banner that has to do with the whole human being. So I don't know if that came across or not. We're talking about the whole human being. Ian, there you are.
Here I am, yes. And so please give a robust round of applause to Dr. Jeannot.
Here's what the communists do. They clap at the same time.
And you can nourish your flesh as well as your mind just down the hall.